Hello and welcome to Motorsport Speak, the motorsport podcast brought to you by the team behind Motorsport Week and motorsportmonday.com. My name's Dan Lawrence, and as ever to talk all things Formula 1, I'm joined by our editor Taylor Powling. We had a chaotic, wet-to-dry Canadian Grand Prix this past weekend in Montreal, and Max Verstappen rose above the chaos to take his 60th Grand Prix victory. But it wasn't without a sustained challenge from the likes of Lando Norris and even George Russell in the Mercedes, the much improved Mercedes. First, Taylor, how are you and did you enjoy the race?
Hi Dan, I'm very well, thanks. I hope you are as well. Yeah, it was a really fascinating race. I've not been too much of a fan of the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve in the dry in recent times. If you look at previous races with the previous regulations of cars, 2017 and 2018 were pretty dull, and then you had the likes of 2019, and then even under this regulation cycle with 2022, you had battles for the lead, but the delta you need to pass was so big that in the dry it was kind of a bit of a dull affair. But this one, with the rain, definitely spiced it up. We had 3 teams going for victory. It was a usual winner, but it could have easily been either a McLaren or a Mercedes win.
Yes, I agree with you. Circuit Gilles Villeneuve, definitely in the past, in the dry, it's shown it's a difficult circuit to pass on, but, it's always got the possibility of changeable weather in Montreal, and we've had that throughout the years, throwing up some classic races. And this one certainly threw up a lot of chaos as well. And, 2022 was a really good example you just mentioned there as well, because I remember that last stint you had Carlos Sainz, who had potentially pace to win the race, but could do nothing to get past Verstappen. But there was plenty of overtaking and plenty of passes on Verstappen as well, with Norris and Russell's challenging. But Verstappen did manage to rise above the challenge from Norris and Russell. So let's talk about Red Bull first, I reckon, because not for the first time this season or in their tenure together as teammates, Verstappen and Sergio Perez had very contrasting weekends. Verstappen obviously just missed out on pole despite setting the identical time to Russell in a little sort of 1997 redo. Perez went out in Q1 for the second weekend in a row. Luckily, he didn't get taken out on the first lap, but he did make a unforced error at turn 6, which ended his race early. So things looking very good for Verstappen, who benefited, I think, from safety car interventions and just sort of, I guess, his wealth of experience and talent to win the race. But not a good weekend for Perez, and one to forget shortly after getting his contract extension.
Yeah, I think not much needs to be said on Verstappen, really. He had that one error at turn 1 when he was pressuring Russell, and that made him vulnerable to Norris, but the DRS was enabled. And at that time, it looked like the race was getting away from him a bit. But Red Bull showed this weekend why having a good car isn't the only thing in your armoury you need to win a world championship. McLaren and Mercedes arguably had a faster car in certain conditions in the race, definitely throughout the weekend. But both fumbled on strategy in some respects, which I'm sure we'll get on to later. But Red Bull were perfect in their calls. Verstappen managed the race perfectly. He might not have had the fastest car, but his final qualifying lap, I think, was exceptional, considering that others were struggling to improve. Both Mercedes didn't improve. Verstappen came that close in probably a car that wasn't a match for the Mercedes. Just is a testament to how strong he is and why Helmut Marko bangs on about Red Bull relying on the Verstappen factor, because he does make the difference when Red Bull are at their strongest, such as circuits like Monaco or here in Canada. Perez, yes, they were hoping the contract renewal news would, release any pressure on him and he'd get back to form. But if anything, it's just deteriorating again. And it has to be a concern because that's now 3 races in a row or 3 rounds in a row where he's not made Q3. He's had 2 successive Q1 exits. I mean, even Miami wasn't a brilliant weekend from him. He was struggling to hold on to the front pack. I was in the camp that I didn't think he'd repeat his slump last season. I thought that was a kind of a one-off with how the car characteristics were. But the longer this goes on, you have to say it's just something inherent with him that he's not gelling with the Red Bull cars as they get developed. The pack's converging. He can't afford to even be a few tenths off Verstappen now because that will cost him multiple places. And it's not just a case of McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes getting closer, that they're filling the gap between the two Red Bulls. He's not even getting out of Q1. He's falling behind the likes of Alpines and Haas cars, and that's not where he should be. The car's much better than that, even if it is difficult to handle. And it's going to reach a point if this carries on where Red Bull have handed in that contract, but they have to be reviewing their options because they can't continue. Because as the pack continues to close up and look ahead to 2025, Red Bull are going to be vulnerable in that Constructors' Championship because Verstappen can't do all the heavy lifting like he did last year.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you, especially with the field converging. I mean, we talk about a matter of temps that Perez can't afford in qualifying. I think top 6 were separated by 2 temps in qualifying, and as you said, he was out in Q1. It's not a case of Verstappen can win the Constructors' title on his own anymore. He definitely needs Perez to step up and perform and be grabbing those points like he was at the start of the season, and that form seems to have disappeared in similar fashion as you said it did last year. It does seem strange to me that after having that slump in 2023 and looking to start like he's having it again this year, that he got that 2-year extension with Red Bull. It's widely believed that the second year on this extension is a team option. So if there's a third season with the European slump in it, possibly Perez won't be in a Red Bull car in 2026. But again, that seems like a long time for Red Bull to gamble on Perez being a consistent sort of, solid number 2 driver. It seems like their decision was based on the first few rounds of the season before the likes of McLaren and Ferrari, and now even possibly Mercedes, got their act together. So, yeah, Perez desperately needs to shake himself out of whatever funk he's in, because it looks like as the season drags on, there's going to be more opportunities for the likes of McLaren and Ferrari to challenge and get victories. I mean, arguably today, any one of 3 different drivers in different teams could have won the race, and that would have made Red Bull's job even harder moving forward. Not that it's supremely difficult. They're still in a comfortable position, but the longer it goes on with Perez, it's going to get less and less comfortable. And it took him a considerable amount of time last season to turn his form around, and I don't think they can afford for it to take that much time this season. But we'll see. I mean, Spain's going to be a better track for Red Bull probably, as it's a more, smoother surface, fast corners, stuff like that. It's not one of these oddball circuits like Monaco and Canada where they've had a few surprises come their way. So maybe Perez will bounce back in Spain. Fingers crossed for him and the team that he does. But 2 drivers that don't really need to bounce back from anything are those that in the papaya McLaren cars. Lando Norris, I think, arguably could have. It's probably the 3rd race now where he feels like he could have won. Obviously, Miami, he succeeded in that task. Imola, he was so close to winning, and here again he had a win slip through his fingers. So still a 1-time Grand Prix winner is Lando Norris, but we could be talking about him being a 3-time Grand Prix winner if things had gone differently. And it was before the first safety car intervention where it really looked like he had the impetus to go on and win after sort of, as the track started to dry in that first intermediate stint, the transition from sort of proper wet to damp and an emerging dry line, he really unlocked some incredible pace to leapfrog both Russell and Verstappen, and was nearly 8 seconds in the lead when Sargent had his off. That brought out the safety car, and it was just ill-timed that the safety car was called in just as he was approaching pit lane entry, and McLaren weren't quick enough to react. So he ended up having to perform I think it was 3 laps he went on longer in the intermediates. It was either 2 or 3 laps to overcut. At least Russell didn't quite have the pace to overcut Verstappen. And but then tyre warm-up issues meant he had to surrender position to Russell anyway after pitting. And then it was a sort of a fight back and a ding-dong between him and Russell to claim best of the rest. But yeah, another great weekend for Norris and McLaren, and Piastri not too far behind as well. Just sort of, he got a bit unlucky with the Mercedes pitting for extra fresh hard tyres. Well, it was hard and medium, wasn't it? The Mercedes drivers, they swapped at the end.
Yeah, they split.
Yeah, But they had the tyre advantage at the end after the second safety car, which meant Piastri couldn't do anything to hold them off really and slipped to fifth. But yeah, another impressive weekend from McLaren.
Yes, and they are now the only team who haven't recorded a DNF yet this season after Ferrari's shambolic outing. Yeah, I found it quite interesting that obviously Norris said McLaren should have won that race, and everyone pointed to pitting one lap too late onto a second set of intermediates. But interestingly, Christian Horner mentioned that he believes they lost it on the second stop. And when you see his argument that he put forward, it does have, some traction behind it. He basically said that extra lap that McLaren did on the overcut might have cost them if they'd have pit a lap earlier and took into account the warm-up that was needed on the slicks. Norris might have got the job done. It was such an interesting race tactically because there were so many different elements that you could pinpoint to say that's where it was won and lost. And obviously McLaren, they fell short on both occasions. And I think that is something I mentioned on the podcast before about just strategically, they're still adapting to being a top team. They're a bit indecisive. I think Red Bull in McLaren's position would have immediately called Norris in. Sellers eased a bit of the pressure on the McLaren pit wall by saying it's much easier for the cars behind to react and do the opposite. But I think in this case it was quite a clear-cut decision to pit, especially with another rain shower imminent. But yeah, Norris was kind of a victim of his own pace, really, because he preserved his intermediates original set much better than the two cars ahead of him, and his pace was unbelievable. He was pulling away at multiple seconds a lap, and at that point it looked like he was going to open up such a gap that nobody could have caught him. He mentioned as well after the race that the overcut that McLaren attempted, he thinks he could have got the gap to Verstappen when he came out big enough that the warm-up wouldn't have affected him enough to lose the lead to Verstappen if he'd have pushed a bit harder on his second set of intermediates, if he'd have passed Russell on track and then closed the gap to Verstappen. So there's 3 different points I've mentioned there where McLaren and Norris think they could have won the race or maybe should have won the race. And yeah, it's just when the gaps are so tight, their car's very, very quick, fundamentally quick everywhere now. They can go to every race expecting to be in the battle for the win. But when you're up against a juggernaut like Red Bull, you've got to be tactically excellent, and they weren't here. And I do also wonder whether later on, if they could have played the game of keeping Piastri in Norris's DRS, whether that would have worked. I know Mercedes were very quick, but they're not the most, slippery down the straights. Canada's not the easiest track to pass on. There was still a bit of dampness offline, and for the first few laps Piastri was actually in Norris's DRS, and the Mercedes didn't mount a challenge. It was only once Piastri dropped out that he then became vulnerable. So it's just these little elements that, the incremental gains where McLaren aren't quite getting nailed at this point, but I'm sure with time they will, and that's something that they'll be investigating internally.
Yeah, I think Verstappen was asked about in the post-race press conference sort of how Canada was an example of when Red Bull are operating at their best from a performance aspect, they still have the sort of, the know-how to operate at like a really high level in the other aspects, so strategy and stuff like that. And that's really what helped elevate them to victory this weekend with Verstappen. And that's a place where, as you say, McLaren maybe made a few mistakes because they're not as experienced. They haven't really had... when was the last time McLaren were consistently fighting for victories? We'd have to go back quite a long way for that to be the case. Probably back to when Hamilton was last in a McLaren. So
yeah, it would be 2012 was the last point where they were a genuine frontrunner, and even then they had, operationally and reliability wise they were poor. So it's not a given, even with a fast car, that you're going to be a race-winning team, and that's something that McLaren are going to have to develop quickly to, not squander this incredible car that they've got.
100%. And moving on to Mercedes, then, sort of talking about teams that are, I guess, maybe used to being winning outfits. Mercedes are probably one of the strongest definitions of that, especially in the past tense, given their recent struggles. But their car really came alive in Montreal, but similar to Red Bull, but not to as an extreme degree. There were different moods either side of the garage. Obviously, Russell had that sensational pole position, setting the identical time to Verstappen, as I said earlier. But because Russell said it first, he got pole. And I mean, by all accounts, he had a quite a strong claim to victory. I think he was comfortable from lights out. He was keeping Verstappen at bay. It was only as the Inters sort of wore out and then Norris came into the fold that Russell was, sort of losing his advantage and losing his pace and slipping between, flitting between the second and third places. And then as the race progressed, I think Russell admitted, didn't he, that mistakes on his side. So not really strategy calls, whereas it was in McLaren's case, but Russell made a few sort of overzealous moves, trying to get by Norris or trying to battle Norris where he lost ground, and then similarly with Piastri right towards the end, having to abort to the final chicane runoff when he was trying to charge back through to the podium. But all in all, I think, as Russell said, if they'd have told Mercedes, if people had told Mercedes coming into the weekend, oh, you're going to get pole position in the podium, they would have bit their hands off. But for Hamilton, it really wasn't that rosy a weekend, or at least it started looking like a good weekend, as it seems to always do with Hamilton this season. He was promising in practice, had good margin in hand at the end of FP3, which he was fastest in, and then the pace seemingly disappears from him in qualifying, which seems to be this running trend. And he winds up 7th on the grid. And then in the race, my feeling personally in the race is just, I got the sense just his performance felt underwhelming. There wasn't any magic or sparkle that we've been used to, especially in these type of conditions that we've seen from Hamilton so many times before. And it wasn't until he got that tyre advantage with the free pit stop at the end that he seemed to have a little bit of pace in hand. And even he himself said it was like one of his worst drives or something like that, so which kind of sums up the mood from Hamilton at the moment. But yeah, promising overall for Mercedes and especially for Russell. And then still strange head scratching going on in the Hamilton side of the garage.
Yeah, Toto, as you said after the race, he was pretty satisfied with P3 and P4, and in the long term, I think you have to look at it as definitely a step in the right direction. They're fairly confident that the upgrades they booked recently have now put their car into a window where they should be competitive everywhere. Obviously, the test will be in Spain, smoother asphalt, conventional circuit, really test the aero efficiency of a car. But based on what we've seen, Mercedes do look like they are now fully in that fight on given weekends, and whether it'll be enough to, challenge Red Bull every weekend, unlikely, because Red Bull should take a step forward when we go to these more conventional and traditional venues, but they're certainly now in that mix with McLaren and Ferrari, and they've also got upgrades to come. They seem like they've been on a really relentless development drive. They look like they've solved their correlation problems. This new front wing has dialed out the balance issues they've had where they couldn't, maximise or optimise both low speed and high speed. So when there was circuits like Spain coming up where you need to be strong in both areas and you have to find that middle ground, Mercedes, they would always compromise. Whereas now it seems like they've eradicated that. And it was a missed opportunity for them. Let's make no mistake. It was a promising result based on what their previous results were. But they should have won. They could have won. Because if you look at it, with the mistake McLaren made with the strategy, if Russell hadn't have gone off when Norris passed him and let Verstappen through, he would have been at the head of the queue to take over the race lead when McLaren fumbled. And when you look at the pace that Mercedes had in the dry, especially late in the race, albeit on fresh tyres, they were still the team to beat. So if Russell would have been at the front and had clear air, I think it would have been very hard for Verstappen to pass him. So I can see why he was quite annoyed with himself. It was definitely an opportunity that he let slip. He made too many mistakes, which is something to keep an eye on with Russell. He does seem a bit mistake prone. I think he's in that kind of Charles Leclerc phase from a few years ago where he's constantly at the limit and that makes him prone to stepping over occasionally. He just needs to, as Leclerc's done, dial it back a bit, because even if he's not 100% all the time, his 99, 98% will still be quick enough to be out the front with the likes of Verstappen, Norris, Leclerc. On Hamilton, he should have won that race in theory as well, because his race pace was actually quite strong, and especially in FP3, Toto Wolff waxed lyrical about Lewis's both short run and long run pace. He looked like it was going to be vintage Hamilton in Montreal. But again, come qualifying, it just dissipated. It was nowhere. And we're talking a matter of 3/10 or less than 3/10 to his teammate. But on a short circuit, when the gaps are so minimal, that makes all the difference. If he'd have qualified higher up and been in Russell's position, do I have faith Hamilton would have won? Yes, I think he's much more experienced in those positions. And when he has a car or when he's in a position to win, he does come alive. But he needs to get that qualifying form sorted, because otherwise these opportunities will keep passing him by if Merc are as competitive as they were last weekend.
Yeah, and what's really strange is the history of Hamilton is he's always been a good qualifier. I mean, not good, let's say great qualifier. So his struggles this year are really quite sort of befuddling. So yeah, I think you're definitely right. I think an experienced head like him, if he'd have converted his practice pace into qualifying pace, then you could have seen a very different mood, outlook and result from him come Sunday. And I think it's an interesting one to sort of keep an eye on what Mercedes are going to do in Spain, given the fact that I think 2 years in a row now, amid difficult ground effect cars that they've produced, Spain has been a circuit where they've been able to come alive. In 2022, they were able to, I think due to the nature of the circuit, run their car at a specific ride height, which meant that it operated in a way that it was, capable of challenging for the win. I mean, Hamilton's pace in 2022 especially was on a par with the Red Bulls, but obviously he was marred by going to the back with his puncher. And then last year, the concept change helped them really come alive and get a double podium. So it'd be interesting to see. I mean, definitely with the upgrades they've put on the car, they should be quicker in Spain, but also be interested to see whether they can then continue it after Spain, as we've seen that Spain has been a slight outlier for them in previous seasons. But yes, it's a strange one. Another team with a Mercedes powertrain needing to improve their form amid upgrade packages was Aston Martin, and they seemingly did that this weekend with a solid result. Both cars in Q3, both cars in the points, 6th and 7th, with Alonso leading the charge, which is perhaps not a surprise. Yes, a promising weekend for Aston Martin, but still, I think they've still got a lot of ground to cover, considering I think them returning to this kind of form is more not having to look over their shoulders, and there's still this gap that's formed between Aston Martin and the top 4 teams.
Yeah, I mean, with Mercedes making that jump and it now being a top 4 fighting for wins, certainly podiums on a regular basis, and with how much Aston Martin have progressed relatively to the competition, unless they find a breakthrough and get on top of their troubles, I don't see them doing anything bar scoring points, very minor points this season. To their credit, they capitalised this weekend. Both drivers are actually there as well, which is good to see. Lance Stroll at his home race, he had a bit of a moment at the Wall of Champions in qualifying, which he believes compromised him, but he finished one place behind his teammate, which in the race was the maximum result he could achieve. So yeah, good weekend for Aston. They did what they've not done over the last few, maximise their own prospects. Alonso said they've started to understand some of their issues. They've got a few ideas up their sleeve. They've got some upgrades potentially being accelerated to Barcelona for Alonso's home race, so the Spanish fans will be hopeful that he can pull off a strong result. But they did expect Canada to suit their car more. So on the basis of that, the fact that they were still the clear 5th fastest team, I think Barcelona is going to be a big test for where they're at, because if they end up being behind RB there, then they've got a real problem on their hands.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar to last year, isn't it, really? Canada was the last podium until Sao Paulo for Alonso, and then Barcelona was where their troubles started in terms of slipping back performance-wise. So it'd be interesting to see whether they have the same fate this season. And you mentioned RB there, so I think it's important to talk about them. And I think we should talk a bit about Daniel Ricciardo first, considering there were some spicy comments regarding him from a certain Jacques Villeneuve, who was with the Sky Sports F1 team in Canada this weekend. and basically went on a bit of a rant, arguing why Ricciardo should be in Formula One. So Ricciardo responded in fine fashion by qualifying in fifth, just two tenths from pole, which was good to see. And I think what we're seeing now, personally for me, we're seeing more instances now of Ricciardo's former, honey badger self coming through, and less of the middling, searching for answers Daniel Ricciardo. I think he's on the precipice of really unlocking being back as a consistent top level performer. I don't know whether that's preemptive to say or not, but I think if it wasn't for his unfortunate rolling start, he probably would have still been in the mix, challenging with the Aston Martins and stuff like that. Instead, he finished 8th. But I think one of Ricciardo's better weekends, perhaps maybe his best weekend of this season so far. Yes. So another really, it was good to see. And I think we were saying in previous episodes earlier this season, have we got this Danny Rick that's only going to be good at Mexico and only going to come alive at Mexico, which he seemingly does every season. But I think we're steering away from that narrative, which is a positive thing. Less than positive, but what I wrote on our driver ratings article on the motorsportweek.com website, that was Yuki Tsunoda having what I think was a blip, because he had his late race spin when he was challenging in the top 10 as well and looking to cement a tidy double points finish for RB if it wasn't for a slightly overzealous mistake at the second chicane. But qualified 8th. Tsunoda seems to be a reliable weapon in qualifying now, where he's getting that RB into the top 10 shootout. And if it wasn't just for a little error there, or lapse of judgment at the end, he would have been picking up some tidy points for the team as well. I think both drivers are getting into we know Tsunoda's having probably his best season to date in F1, but the pair of them now seem to be really performing to a level that seems to be rising for RB as a team. As we said, Aston Martin have been looking over their shoulder slightly, and that's because of RB's progress. So an altogether positive weekend for them, with just a couple of blips.
Yeah, I never subscribed to the theory or the idea that Ricciardo's slump this year was a replica of his McLaren days. There was always little glimmers of promise. He just hasn't been able to extract it on a consistent enough basis for whatever reason. I still do think it's premature to say he's back in any sense. And the reason why is because when you actually look at the weekend results, Tsunoda led him in Q1 and Q2 and would have potentially been ahead in Q3 as well, if not for a gust of wind on the exit of turn 2 on his final Q3 run. So to me, it didn't scream vintage Ricciardo. He's still not at that top level that he's been at previously. And that's a testament to how good he was back in the day, because him getting 5th and me being critical of it shows how good he once was. I'm still waiting for that kind of, bang moment from Ricciardo. That still didn't feel like it to me, him qualifying 5th. I think in isolation, that Miami sprint sessions was a bang Ricciardo moment because he was just genuinely top tier on that day. But this was his strongest weekend because he put it together in qualifying, which he's not been able to do on a consistent basis this year. And then when the race came and, you had these changing conditions, you thought, he might slip up here. A lot of drivers did. It'd be an easy banana skin. He didn't. He drove a matured race. He was a bit unfortunate with that penalty. It was a clutch issue, which RB had a few start problems, but they've not had, one where it's led to a jump start and they got punished under the new tighter regulations that the FIA have imposed on jump starts. Without that, he would have probably split the Aston Martins because I believe he was ahead of Lance Stroll before his penalty. Tsunoda, that wasn't the best moment he's had this season in the race. It was unfortunate. He locked up his front right wheel into the chicane. And then because he was so close to the car ahead, obviously you lose downforce, so that meant he went straight on, and because the grass was wet, I think at that moment, maybe he wasn't really thinking straight, about the implications of the grass being wet and just floored it across the runoff, and that put him into a spin where he was very lucky not to get collected. But that's his first big mistake this year, and it's kind of good that it's come at a time when his contract's been sorted and he's guaranteed to be on the grid next year. Interestingly, I don't think this is the end necessarily of the story of Tsunoda's future, because if you remember in 2022, Gasly was announced as an AlphaTauri driver for 2023, and it just turned out that they'd taken the option up on him, and it meant when Alpine wanted him, they had to pay, buy him out of his contract. And I feel like that's the wording of the announcement, with RB saying they've taken up the option in his contract, because obviously the Red Bull athletes are contracted to the actual Red Bull company rather than the individual teams, the racing teams. I get the sense that they've done that to take the option up on him, because I think they have to by September to keep him in their stable. And then if someone like Audi comes sniffing, if they're not able to entice Carlos Sainz to the team next year, Tsunoda surely has got to be under the options.
Yeah, I think it's also telling that obviously the options for 2025 with Honda coming into Aston Martin in 2026, and I think not only is Tsunoda got Red Bull protections, for want of a better word, but he most certainly does have Honda in his corner, and I think as long as Honda are in F1, they're going to be looking to make sure that Tsunoda is. So, which might be a difficult situation to play with Aston Martin in 2026, given obviously Lance Stroll standing in that team and Alonso's contract. But I think Tsunoda is a driver that has, and you mentioned Audi there's more than one avenue that he can go down, and it just looks like RB is sort of, as you say, it's a financial protection that they've put on him, but also for Tsunoda, he's confidence that he knows, whatever the weather really, he's going to be on the grid next year, and he's thoroughly earned it, I think, based on his performances this year. I think he's sort of coming into his own as a Grand Prix driver in his fourth season. So Tsunoda, for me now, I'm not sure what he's got left to prove to Red Bull, to be honest. I mean, if I was to want to pick between Perez and Tsunoda right now based on form, I would definitely be going Tsunoda's direction. But clearly Red Bull see differently, and I guess they've got all the information in front of them, whereas I don't. But that's just my 2 cents on that. Also, back on the Jacques Villeneuve thing, I think it's quite ironic, a driver that had the catastrophic end to his F1 career that he did, that he's calling for a driver of Ricciardo's stature to be out of the grid. That's my I don't even think that's a hot take. That's my take on that.
Yeah, I wasn't impressed with either of them, to be honest. I thought they were both quite petty about it. The actual thing, one of the things actually quite annoyed me is on social media, people taking aim at Villeneuve's career, in general, acting like, whether you want to discuss who was a better driver at their peak, Ricciardo or Villeneuve's irrelevant. Villeneuve's still an Indy 500 winner and a Formula 1 world champion. That is a very high level driver at his peak. And for people, or especially newer fans particularly, to undermine that for the sense of, defending a driver that's one of the favourites on the grid, I think was wrong. What Villeneuve actually said was true in many essence. The only thing I disagreed with on was him saying that Ricciardo's not, been impressive since his Red Bull days, which is factually incorrect, because at Renault he was very good. So that did come across as a bit of a vendetta against Ricciardo, but he came into that segment on Sky, intending to, have a pop at Ricciardo, which I think was wrong. It wasn't off the cuff remarks. But at the same point, I think Ricciardo took the wrong approach with some of the things he said after qualifying. The comment especially about, him saying Villeneuve always talks, a lot of criticism, and has he hit his head from playing, I think it was ice hockey or something along those lines. I thought, although it's, it's typical Ricciardo and he's probably pumped with adrenaline and a bit peed off about those comments that have been made, I think when you've had the season that Ricciardo's had, and when the race still hasn't happened, it would have been wise for him just to have, played the PR game of saying that he hasn't heard it or whatnot. Getting embroiled in those games can come back to bite you, especially if this doesn't turn out to be the start of his revival. And if he does, have another slump, then he looks a bit silly that he said all these things. So on both accounts, I just think it was a bit petty, and they both could have avoided some of the comments they made, and it kind of needs to stop dead here and not become a running saga.
Yes, which, well, yeah, it'd be interesting to see whether that happens. I mean, Ricciardo's right in the fact I think Villeneuve as a pundit does like to come out with hot takes, or he's not shy to voice his opinion. Let's put it that way. But yeah, let's move on before we go down the Villeneuve Ricciardo rabbit hole any further. Let's talk about Alpine, where it always seems to be fun and games at the Anglo-French outfit. They never seem to be shy of having some sort of calamity or weird situation going on. Luckily, their teammates didn't crash into each other, which is always good. Alpine announced, I think, that Ocon won't be staying with the team, or it was a joint announcement, but before his situation for 2025 has been settled, we know it's not going to be at Alpine. The timing of that being shortly after the fury that he invoked in Bruno Faman after crashing into Gasly at Monaco is, maybe that's got something to do with it. But regardless, it was a positive weekend for Alpine in terms of a result. They not the best qualifying, obviously. Ocon had to start from P18 with his penalty, and which would have put him at the back of the grid, but Sauber broke parc ferme, so he started from P18. Gasly started from P15, and they finished 9th and 10th after a little bit of team orders at the end, which I've seen footage in the team radio and stuff from this. So obviously they were trying to chase Ricciardo in 8th, and Ocon was in front of Gasly. They were on basically the same strategy, I believe. But then Ocon was instructed to let Gasly through so Gasly could try and overtake Ricciardo. Ocon, obviously being Ocon, protested a little bit, eventually conceded, and then asked for the position back when Gasly failed to get past Ricciardo, and that wasn't granted, and was quite cross at the end of the race. So a good result from Alpine, but they still managed to get themselves involved in a little bit of drama.
Yes, Ocon was not happy with the decision. I think Bruno Faman said that he was nursing an electrical problem, and Hulkenberg was too close at the end to be able to swap them. I think Ocon, I could be wrong, but the fact that he delayed letting a Gasly through and then let him through on the penultimate lap halfway round, when it was pretty clear at that point Gasly wasn't going to be able to overtake Ricciardo, might have been on purpose. Who knows? I mean, neither driver's Ocon's not going to admit that, but yeah, I suspect that might have been at play. Could they have swapped back? Looking at how close Hulkenberg was at the end, it looked difficult to do, and it could have compromised the team result. And I think just because of the timing and that Ocon's leaving, I think definitely kind of contributed to the reaction being a bit more overblown than it needs to, because they still got 3 points, double points all, and once again it's a bit of a shame for Alpine that the focus on their strong result isn't actually on the team's progress, but rather than shenanigans between the two drivers.
Yes, this latest drama between Alpine and Ocon, amid the whole fact that he's going to be leaving the team at the end of the season, it is starting to create a less than pretty picture. And it's a long season still. I think they're going to need to have another sit down or another conversation. They need to get on the same wavelength, because otherwise I can see these sort of situations just continuing if Ocon doesn't, for want of a better word, mature a bit to the situation. He needs to still be a team player. He's still an Alpine driver until the end of the 2025 season. And I think if there is any sort of prejudice towards him from the team side, that needs to subside as well. Otherwise, they're going to cost each other results as the season goes on. So yeah, an interesting saga there with Alpine and Ocon, but it seems a bit more rosier on the Gasly side of the garage for the time being. But yes, moving on down the pecking order. You mentioned Hulkenberg there being a threat to Alpine at the end. I think they didn't pick up points, but from the race, I think Haas were... One, they provided us a lot of entertainment at the start, being the only two cars to to run on the wet tyres and charging through from their lowly grid positions, and Magnussen rising from 14th to 4th at one stage, and Hulkenberg rising into the top 10 from 17th on the grid. It was really exciting to see, and obviously as the race progressed and conditions changed, it got away from them. But neither driver made a catastrophic error, whereas the likes of Perez did and some other drivers, which we'll get onto. And as you said, Hulkenberg had pace there, but they almost got themselves back into the points. And I think from where they started on the grid, 11th and 12th, was a very good result. And yeah, just Haas altogether in 2024 seem to be operating at quite a good level compared to where they were last year. And yeah, I think if circumstances had gone their way a little bit different, perhaps they would have got a point or two, but still I think a very solid race day for them.
Yeah, I think actually they should be a bit disappointed not to get a point. As you said, Hulkenberg was up to 8th, Magnussen up to 4th. And with the 8-second pit stop, I think it was that Magnussen had, he dropped down to around 13th, 14th place. So if you take those 4 seconds off, even if they get a 4-second pit stop in, he's probably sitting in the points at that stage on fresh intermediates as well. So might not have needed to pit for another set of intermediates when the safety car was out. So I feel like it was a missed opportunity. They did the inspired call at the start. They had nothing to lose, and it made sense. I'm surprised other teams like Sauber or Alpine. I mean, it worked out for Alpine in the end, but they didn't try it. So yeah, it was good to see Haas, taking the initiative and being brave. They feel like they've done that a few times in previous years, but not necessarily last season or this season. Thinking back to Hungary 2020, I think it was when they pitted at the end of the formation lap onto the dries, and that helped them to bag a points finish that wasn't forthcoming too often that season. They've not scored, I think, in the last 3 rounds. They're only 2 points above Alpine, so they've got look behind them more than in front of them. RB, I think RB are gone now. We did say when the battle was quite close that RB would be able to outdevelop them, and since Miami, that's really been the case. Haas, they've got to be wary of. I know they're the smallest team on the grid operationally, but not having another slump from a good start that they've tended to have in quite a lot of seasons. They need to sustain that development and get back to point scoring ways. I think once they get that drought over with, that'll kind of be a big monkey off their back and hopefully back to a bit of stability.
Yeah, definitely. The ship sailed on the RB front. They're sort of in a mini no man's land in a sense, aren't they? In terms of they probably can't challenge. Their ceiling's probably been hit in terms of where they could achieve in the constructors' standings, but now it's a case of making sure that they're not, caught up by the likes of Williams, who are, I think, improving as they sort of, take the weight out of their car, or at least one of the cars. I don't think Haas have to worry about Sauber, who, despite finishing 13th and 15th, that was really due to just other people failing to finish, essentially. They remain the only pointless outfit in the series so far in 2024, and it doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon because they're just lacking speed. And Zhou had a weekend to forget again, slowest in qualifying, multiple crashes in practice, seemingly lacking confidence when he really needs to be showing other teams on the grid that he's worthy to take a punt on in 2025. Yeah, not a lot to write home about on the Sauber front, is there?
No, but I mean, it speaks volumes that the only time you actually noticed them last weekend was when Joe was in the wall in both in FP1 and FP3, I think it was. Yeah, I mean, most of the time in the races, you don't even see them. They took a gamble on making some setup changes with a pit lane start, but they just didn't have the pace. There were a few occasions earlier in the season, like Japan springs to mind, where they actually did have decent race pace and could have scored without their pit stop woes. But both Monaco and Canada, they were by far the slowest. It seems they don't have a grasp on their car, the aero concepts, not delivering what they expected from the wind tunnel. And I personally could see them doing a Haas from 2021 next year, where they just give up on the current set of regs and just focus all on 2026. And at the end of the day, it's worthwhile them doing that, because 2026, not only is it a reset for everyone, they're coming with the might of Audi. they can't afford to be caught slacking with Audi's name behind them. It might be tough for their drivers next year, Hulkenberg, and whether that be a Sainz or an Ocon or a Tsunoda. But at the end of the day, those drivers are signing up for a long-term project, and it'd be wrong for the him-wheel-based squad to chase marginal gains under this regulation cycle when they're seeding the midfield over potentially, laying down some good foundations with Audi.
Yes. I mean, there's an interesting point you raised there with the Haas 2021 example. I think with Haas, given their sort of independent status and maybe their sort of, their alternative status in terms of how an F1 team is run, they had the flexibility to make that choice. Does Sauber, a team that Audi's already ramping up its involvement, and we've seen in the past when automotive giants with a bit more of a corporate mindset get involved in Formula One teams, they don't necessarily act like a racing team does. Would they be happy, even though their name's not on the car next year, with Sauber doing something like Haas did in 2021? I'm not sure. But yeah, it's certainly something radical does need to happen between now and 2026 for Audi to save some sort of face when they come into the sport, because I think people aren't going to expect them to be right at the front, but if they perform how Sauber's performing currently, it's not going to look good, especially with the likes of Williams slowly drawing forward. And I mean, arguably Williams this weekend should have got points with Albon if it wasn't for him being collected by Sainz when Sainz spun out, and even Logan Sargent got into Q2 without the lighter floor on his car. Unfortunately for him, he had multiple offs and then a DNF partway through the race, which I guess was symbolic of his sort of standing and the jeopardy around his F1 future, was that he had another sort of patchy, inconsistent weekend with mistakes in it. So, trouble for Sauber, promise for Williams, especially with the Albon side of the garage.
It was made even worse for Albon by the fact that he was ahead of Sainz, and I've seen the actual replay now. I think it was Perez went wide at turn 6. Him rejoining then compromised the Alpine ahead, and Albon slowed them both down. Albon kind of got a bit of a tank slapper on the exit with the wet patch, and then that's when Sainz got through. And the next time around, Sainz literally went off at turn 6, and then Albon was collateral damage in it. Without that Perez moment, Albon did nothing wrong. He'd have been running where he was and wouldn't have been impacted by Sainz. Just so happened they got collected, and that's the sort of luck that Williams don't need. But it's promising signs for them that 2 races in a row. I know you've got some similarities with Canada and Monaco and Montreal with the bumps and the curbs, but they are still fundamentally different circuits. One's very much low speed, the other's got a few more high speed elements. They were competitive and they were Q3 attendees and points contenders. Albon also took promise.
And Albon did that incredible double overtake.
Oh, that's got to be one of the overtakes of the season. I'm surprised it wouldn't be up there at the end. The fact that he, had the mind to, notice that he was a bit compromised and boxed in, and actually went for that move on the second move on Ricciardo's inside and made it stick, was just hats off. That was really well thought of, and it deserved the points finish, but they've got some upgrades come in. They've not done much aerodynamically with the car this season, so hopefully for Albon's sake, when they bring some upgrades, they can start taking some real strides forward and being in this position on a consistent basis.
Yeah, and it's, when we talk about upgrades, we always talk about Albon, because I think just the the way Williams are operating at the moment, they don't have the financial flexibility to be able to bring 2 sets of upgrades at the same time. So poor old Sargent doesn't quite get the upgraded spec cars that Albon does, which isn't helping his cause. But I think the writing's on the wall there anyway for the young American. But and it could possibly be the likes of Sainz that replaces him, despite taking out Albon. He's hopefully still in James Fowler's good books. But should we talk about Ferrari next? Because they're the only team we haven't spoken about, and that's because they had an absolutely shambolic weekend. So I think we should talk about the Scuderia's woe next, and I'll leave that to you, Taylor, to talk us through what went wrong for them.
So yes, Ferrari came into the weekend billed as the favourites because of Monaco and how compliant the SF24 was over the curbs and bumps. And through the limited running on Friday, things looked to be, unravelling in that fashion. Leclerc said, come rain or shine, they were looking in good shape, but come qualifying, and it shines more than it rained. There were kind of a few drops threatening, very dark clouds, but the rain stayed away. But in the cold temperatures, Ferrari couldn't get the tyres fired up, and they succumbed to a double Q2 exit. They were much more confident in their race pace. They thought they had a chance to at least salvage some points. I mean, they weren't going to challenge any of the top three teams unless a miracle happened. But they had at least the chance to maybe beat the Aston Martins and get 6th and 7th. But Leclerc had an engine issue from the second lap onwards. He was told originally it was costing him about half a second a lap, and it then developed to actually get worse and cost him over a second per lap at some stages. So once DRS was enabled, he got overtaken by, I think, Albon and Tsunoda, dropped outside the points. At that point, Ferrari thought that their red flag hadn't come. They were gambling on a red flag to be able to reset the engine. So they pitted him. They were trying to time it with a crossover onto slicks, but the track was still too damp, and the rain shower came, which meant Leclerc got lapped, and he came back into the pits for intermediates, but then they boxed him and retired his car, which was the wise decision to do, because although he was at the head of the pack for a little bit, it was because he was about to go a lap down. So yeah, not the weekend he wanted after winning in Monaco, but I think he made a good point. It's crucial for Ferrari not to overreact. He said they shouldn't have overreacted after Monaco with the win, and they shouldn't overreact here. It's just a bad weekend. I think the most important thing is how they learn lessons from it and come back stronger. And I think under Fred Vasseur's leadership, that is definitely something that they will do, and they will, be stronger for this experience. That it was quite premature for there to be talk about a 2024 title challenge. They have got the third fastest car, there's no doubt in my mind. It's marginal gaps, but Red Bull have got the outright strongest car. I think McLaren have got the most versatile car, and then you've got Ferrari, who in optimal conditions, they arguably are the strongest, along with Red Bull, but it's just not consistent enough. They do have those vulnerabilities in cooler temperatures, and whether that's something they can solve with upgrades coming up, they're taught there will bring upgrades to Barcelona that were meant for Silverstone. I'm skeptical on that. I think it's more of a seismic change that they need to undergo, possibly mid-season or even over the off-season, to be able to solve it. And with Mercedes on their backs now as well, they can't afford to have this kind of hindrance, because there will be more circuits, especially past the European season, I think, like when you get towards the end of the year, where there could be cooler conditions, and if they're having these same problems, then they're going to be automatically out of the fight. Carlos Sainz had a really strange weekend. He wasn't far off Leclerc in qualifying. It was a matter of a few hundreds. But at the start, he lost a few places, and he didn't have the pace in general. Leclerc was quicker than him with an engine that was misfiring. And then just when he was starting to get back into his groove on the slicks and looking to make up places, he was taking more risks, got on a damp patch to turn 6, and he span, and then Albon clipped him, and he already had damage to his front wing and floor, I believe, from contact with Bottas at the hairpin. So yeah, he was at the points anyway. The damage was quite severe, so they retired his car. All in all, not a good weekend for Ferrari, and I'd be surprised now if they need these upgrades coming to Barcelona to not be seismic, because the gaps are so marginal, but to be a decent enough step that they can find that last tenth or two. They do look like they're lacking to Red Bull and McLaren.
Yes, I think one thing's for certain is that they shouldn't have to worry about cool temperatures next time out. Spain is normally quite hot, so that could hopefully improve their chances just a tad. But yeah, I agree. I think, title challenge probably overblown, and then, as Leclerc said, there's no need to overreact from them having an off weekend. I mean, I think a lot was said on social media about Ferrari putting on the hard tyres on Leclerc's car, but when your race is already basically over, you might as well try and gamble on that forecasted rain shower missing the circuit, because if that happens, then maybe you salvage something. I mean, when you're in a position where you're already at the back, basically, you've got nothing to lose. So Again, yeah, an overreaction. And I think, as you say, Fred Vasseur is the right man to steer the ship in the right direction. I think also, as you say, with Mercedes improving and the sort of the natures of these characteristics in the Ferrari car that probably will take an off-season to fix, I think it is important and imperative that they fix like these tyre warm-up issues in qualifying and the certain peakiness of the car where it's, as you say, it's not like the McLaren, it's not capable at every single circuit. They do need to fix that, especially when you've got Lewis Hamilton coming from Mercedes. If that coincides with Mercedes getting their act together and Ferrari failing to continue its progress, then that whole, driver move and that new driver-team relationship may not be as harmonious as previously envisioned. So, yeah, no need to hit the panic button, but things to keep an eye on for the Maranello-based squad. But I'm sure we'll be talking completely differently about Ferrari after the next Grand Prix, where perhaps they have a strong podium or even challenge for victory. So that is the fun nature of Formula 1 in 2024, where the form book isn't set in stone, and nor is who's going to win each race. So I think we're in a really positive place now with the sport. And I would say that that's possibly a good place to end. So Taylor, thank you for joining me, and listeners, thank you for joining us as we prattle on and speak about the Canadian Grand Prix and look ahead for what's to come in Formula 1 in Spain and beyond. So make sure to keep up to date with the podcast, like and subscribe. Keep up to date with Motorsport Week and motorsportmonday.com, and follow us on socials at Motorsport Week on X, formerly known as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube and TikTok. But for now, goodbye.